Ed Remus. I'm the moderator of this panel and a member of the Products Affiliated Society. I want to thank all of our panelists for coming today. Unfortunately, I heard from Kaya Heller that she could not attend. She let me know a little bit about that, which is unfortunate because we were hoping she could speak to the social ecology perspective into the work of Murray Bookchin. So we'll have to proceed without her today. So what I'd like to do is present a few introductory remarks to kind of frame some of the questions, and then after that, each of the panelists will have an opportunity to speak, and then to respond to each other, and then we can open it up for questions. So, technological change under capital has tended to generate two forms of political response: romantic rejection and modernistic embrace. In 1995, the neo-Luddite Kirkpatrick Sale began a public lecture by smashing a computer to pieces with his hammer. I won't perform any theatrics like that today. At the same time, Antonio Negri entreated knowledge workers to wake up from their slumbers. Communism had arrived, as their digital labor was immaterial. Between rejection and embrace stood Jeremy Rifkin, a reform-minded activist who diagnosed increasing and permanent unemployment due to automation. Rifkin suggested that the victims of this process be put to work in a new nonprofit sector. These are just a few examples of how technological unemployment captured the attention of the 1990s left, but in a way that now seems antiquated. Activist movements emerged to oppose globalization, imperialism, and most recently finance capital. The politicization of compulsory work appears rare by comparison. Yet the historical left's most compelling visions of social emancipation have related crucially to understandings of technology and work. For this reason, we pose a number of untimely questions here today. First, can Marxism explain some of the broadest social and technological changes that have taken place since the 1960s? For Marx, the working class's organization around higher wages drives capitalists to introduce labor-saving technologies, a dynamic which unconsciously increases both social productivity and unemployment, while decreasing surplus value available to capitalists. This dynamic generates crises to which the capitalist state responds. Later Marxists observed that the liberal, Fordist, and neoliberal periods have each entailed increases of productivity and renegotiations of labor standards, but during varying configurations of political consciousness on the left. How then do the innovations of recent decades, including cybernetics, automation, and digitization, contrast with the development and deployment of productive technologies in the past, whether 50, 100, or 200 years ago? Is technological advance bound up with social totality, or does it take place in a relatively autonomous sphere, with its pace guided by the progress of science? How do Marxist understandings of categories such as value, labor, and class bear upon narratives of social change, such as post-industrial society, information society, third wave, and late capitalism? Second, how does the decline of the left in the 20th century bear upon the abolition of wage labor? The reduction of working hours was a fixture of 19th century socialism, and Paul Lafargue's The Right to be Lazy, calling for a 15-hour working week, was a bestseller among the Second International. More contentious was the question of whether Russian industry had developed sufficiently by 1917 to allow for truly socialist, as opposed to merely liberal bourgeois, reductions in compulsory labor. While Stalin industrialized Russia and made a cult of work, the Great Depression left millions of men and machines idle. Trotsky described conditions for revolution as not only ripe, but somewhat rotten. Non-Marxists such as Russell and Keynes called for a reduced working week, as did the once popular shorter hours movement. Yet organized labor chose not to pursue a reduced working week, fighting instead for New Deal policies which alleviated only privileged sections of workers by comparison. By 1956, Adorno and Horkheimer still spoke of abolishing wage labor as an emancipatory goal, but this goal seemed abandoned elsewhere. Is it fair to claim, as some have, that the 20th century left traded the goal of abolishing work for a kind of workerism? Third, what was politically possible after the new left? The 1960s left appears highly ambivalent about the working class. Theories of a post-scarcity, post-industrial society were gaining purchase, arising from a wide range of new leftists such as Gorz, academic sociologists such as Bell, anarchists such as Bookchin, and futurists such as Toffler. For some, the technology-enabled abolition of work reemerged as the left's core vision of emancipation. This called into question the working class orientations of organized labor, parliamentary socialism, Bolshevism, and Maoism. Alcarismo and early autonomous Marxism tentatively shared this rethinking of the traditional working class. Yet during the very same period, the new communist movement typically followed the what is to be done model of party building, and fused cadres with the factories and neighborhoods of the industrial proletariat. For those who continued to hold the industrial proletariat capable of being a revolutionary subject, how were phenomena such as plant closings, layoffs, and industrial automation politicized? Considering that the working class was losing work throughout much of the 1970s and 1980s, how did the left respond, and what could the left have done? Fourth, can technology or lack thereof explain the failures of actually existing socialism? In 1980, Alvin Toffler announced the third wave. After the first agricultural and second industrial waves, a third information-based wave had arrived and would eventually overcome material scarcity. For Toffler, who grew up in and around the communist movement prior to McCarthyism, socialism and capitalism share a key limitation. They are industrializing projects of the second wave. Some have taken this to mean that socialism has never hitherto been possible, not only because Russia faced the challenge of industrialization, but because, as Martin Nicolaus suggested in 1968, even highly developed countries remain largely industrial and thus premature. Insofar as this narrative seeks to explain the failures of revolutionary movements in Europe and the United States, it is interesting to note that many new communist movement veterans embraced Toffler's third wave thesis, especially after 1989. Is post-industrial society more amenable to emancipatory social transformation than industrial society? And if so, why? Finally, what became the left's mid-1990s engagement of technological unemployment? Between 1994 and 1996, a strange abundance of books engaging questions of technology and labor were published. Jeremy Rifkin's The End of Work, Kirkpatrick Sale's Rebels Against the Future, Stanley Aronowitz's The Jobless Future, Chris Freeman's Work for All or Mass Unemployment, William Julius Wilson's When Work Disappears, Martin Negri's Labor of Dionysus. What can the next generation on the left learn from 1990s debates about immaterial labor, the jobless future, and the end of work? So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our panelists to begin, and we'll start with George.
Okay, thank you. Very happy to be here. We've got a dense set of issues to deal with. Thank you.
An hour-long question,
yes.
4 minutes answer.
Right. And so inevitably, we'll have to take one step at a time. Okay. I'd like to direct my comments to the question, because this issue concerning the end of work, the themes of post-industrial society have been something that have been very much part of my political and theoretical life for decades. And it's a good moment to step back and look and see what has happened in terms of these theses. Because in a very important sense, we've had a disconfirmation in both an empirical and theoretical way of some of the most flagrant forms of views that we were at a world historical period that meant the end of work, the end of basically the labor theory of value and what it has meant in terms of operation of capitalism in not only our period but in previous periods. So this is, I think the disconfirmation has at least two sides to it. And explain it. And by the way, how much time? There's about 10 minutes or 8 to 10 minutes. The disconfirmation in terms of the question of whether we have actually come to this world historical period is twofold. One, empirical. I think that over the last, since 1989, and since the double developments of both structural adjustment policies around the world that have profoundly had a major impact throughout the planet, especially in the former colonial world, as well as, of course, the end of the official Communist Party hegemony in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. What we've had actually is, if these theories concerning post-industrial society were correct, we won't have a situation where billions of people in China, in Africa, in South America, in Eastern Europe, billions and billions of people who would be, in effect, without work. But actually, when we step back and we see actually the world labor market, that is the number of workers that are available for work in commodity production for the world market, actually has tremendously increased in the last 20 to 25 years. I think that the entrance, you asked, you have a question about that?
Oh, no, I was intrigued by that.
Okay. So if we look at what has happened in terms of the impact of these major political economic changes that have taken place, in fact, instead of having a breakdown, a major crisis in terms of livelihood for billions of people would be actually upon us, and that hasn't happened. The other thing that I think is important is to begin to see that at least some of the adherents or former adherents to this kind of end of work conception of contemporary capitalism have sort of changed their position quite dramatically. I'm not sure exactly why some of these people, like Tony Negri, for example, and Christian Marazzi, and a whole set of people who are often called autonomous Marxists, who are called autonomous Marxists, they basically have sort of shifted their view from the view that the labor theory of value no more applies to capitalism. It seems to be that seems to have gone by the wayside. And what has happened is that this type of work that is associated and often called immaterial labor is being seen as actually productive of value, but in and of itself, this value is not measurable. That is, so the view is that we have a kind of work that is largely autonomous of capital, but which capital still can capture some value from, although that value is not the value of the sort that we associate with the classic Marxist description of how surplus value is generated and captured by, the capitalist system. So I would say that these two developments are, speak to exactly your question, that these theories of the end of work that developed in the 1990s have, in a sense, have been rejected and are not part of the present discussion. So I would say that there's a lot more to say about these other questions, but I'm looking forward to seeing about developing our discussion here concerning both the empirical and the theoretical changes that occurred since the 1990s.
Okay, well, I guess I'm here to defend this kind of post-industrial current of thinking. You mentioned the Marty Nicolaus article on the unknown Marx, and I too was very much influenced that Nicolaus was writing about Marx's Grundrisse, which he was among the first to translate, and these were the notebooks that Marx wrote in preparation for writing Capital, and there are passages in the Grundrisse where Marx anticipates this advanced stage of automation. He's literally looking like 100 years forward in terms of where technology was at the time that he was writing. And so just to give you chapter and verse, slightly edited, in this transformation, what appears as the mainstay of production and wealth is the appropriation by man, of his own general productive force, his understanding of nature and the mastery of it, in a word, the development of the social individual. The theft of others' labor time, upon which wealth depends today, seems to be a miserable basis compared with this newly developed foundation that has been created by heavy industry or automation. So I think that I continue to find this inspiring and a way of understanding contradictions which are playing out at this point in time. But I would essentially separate this, what I see as a kind of a post-industrial argument that at a certain stage in the development of technology, productive forces, if you will, there are a set of contradictions which are new and different from the contradictions of earlier moments of economic development. And that I would distinguish, I think that I was never associated with the kind of end of work position. I think that that even if one includes China, one can see a contraction globally in the amount of manufacturing, the size of the manufacturing labor force globally, but obviously there are huge expansion of jobs in the service sector and so forth. So I see the contradiction. Obviously, unemployment, displacement is part of the tension, but I really think that the core that Marx's insight gets at is that science and technology become a productive force, and the advance of society is no longer dependent upon the bourgeoisie, that their savings and investment, their entrepreneurial skill is no longer at the center of the development of the human capacity to produce more and better and more freely. So it's that contradiction that the post-industrial moment opens up this possibility of a self-organization, or a deeper possibility of a self-organization of society without the capitalists. So I've been doing this research on innovation, and it kind of dovetails with this, because what you look at when you see the U.S. over the last 40 years, that when you go back 40 years ago, a lot of the new products, the new ideas, the new processes were coming out of the labs of big Fortune 500 corporations. We were still heavily dependent upon the bourgeoisie but now that's changed dramatically, and those new ideas, those innovations are coming out of collaborations between small firms, universities, government labs. It's the scientists and the technologists who are driving the process. And so I would argue that a part of the crisis that the global financial crisis is that the capital essentially has moved in a more predatory direction. In other words, that the bourgeoisie is no longer playing this historically productive role, and so they're increasingly driven to extractive activity, and so that lies behind financialization. And that extractive activity is also extremely heavily dependent upon the state. So the most important sectors of business, like big pharma, the defense industries, the financial sector, are dependent upon these ties to the state to protect their intellectual property, to preserve their position. And so the idea is that it's not just innovation, but increasingly production itself that's moving out of the corporate sector, the sector dominated by big corporations. So, one of the examples of that is open source software, where we see collaborations among the technologists themselves with no direction from capital. But in all kinds of other areas, I mean, even the automobile was historically, the big companies produced it all on site. But that now 70 to 80% of the value added in the automobile is produced by small and medium-sized enterprises. So the idea is essentially that the advance of technologies essentially gives a much greater possibility for organizing production outside of the control of big capital. And so I think that one can kind of see in both the strategy and the message of Occupy Wall Street, a kind of suggestion of what needs to be a kind of two-pronged strategy for the left in this period. On the one hand, we need this kind of fierce attack on the corporate/financial system to essentially weaken their death grip on the state that is necessary to preserve their power. And at the same time, we have to begin the project of building a prefigurative economy from the ground up. And I hope that Carl's going to talk about this theme, but that this development of productive forces makes possible the development of employee co-ops, of self-organized work, and that I guess the way that I would put it is that in the industrial era, in the era of the great factory, the factory was the instrument that taught the workers about the possibility of socialism. They were there producing, and they could say, look, there are 10,000 of us. We could do this without the capitalists. The decline of the left is very closely linked to the decline of those giant factories everywhere except, they remain in China. But that in this new era, the way that we're going to bring the consciousness of the capacity for a new kind of society based upon autonomous production requires showing people that it is possible to organize production effectively outside the control of the giant corporations. Create these models, which we already have around the world, Mondragon particularly, but build on those models in the US as a way to prefigure the possibility, as a way to instruct people about the real concrete possibility of a self-organized society. So I'll stop there.
This is going to be hard because in the outline you gave, you basically told the story of my life. And I can start anywhere. Marty Nicklaus and I were roommates while he was translating Nicola and Teresa. One of the first major study groups I started when all my Maoist groups would collapse was called the Third Wave Study Group. We started with Toffler's book, and I went through about 200 others after that. I think I'll start at the beginning. I was a young kid in western Pennsylvania. I had a very blue-collar technical background. My dad repaired trucks for a gas company and coal mines. And I was a young kid. I always had to tear things apart and put them back together again to see how they worked. later in life when I worked in a factory and they brought in computers, it was the same thing. I had to learn how these things work because I knew they were going to change the world. So I became a hardware guy. I took computers apart, put them back together, really got into what machine code and everything about what made them work and why they had revolutionary potential. In the university, I studied Marx. I love Marx. I loved it because of the classless society, but I read it a little differently than most people do. Most people, when they hear classless society, they say, well, let's get rid of the capitalists, great. But the way I read it, I said, yeah, that's fine, but mainly, let's get rid of the working class. To me, a real classless society means to get rid of all of them, the whole range of classes, including the working class. And how do you get rid of the working class? Shrinking the working day towards zero. Shrinking variable capital towards zero so that the amount of labor time in any given commodity approaches zero. How do you do that? Fully cybernated, fully automated production, which withers away the market as well as the state. So I had this visionary conception of Marxism that I got from reading Hegel and then going into Marx. When I got into the university because I was a Sputnik kid. I designed a 3-stage rocket at the Industrial Arts Fair. And that got me into the university, but then I switched over to philosophy and science, philosophy of science. So anyway, I've always been into this stuff. And I've always, and the question here about whether Marxism makes sense of all this, absolutely. It's all in Marx. The thing is, though, you have to emancipate your minds, free your imagination. Don't just look at some given text or commentary on Marx. You got to get inside of his head. And you got to look at the world afresh the way he might, and free your minds, not just old dogma. One of the first things we did when all my Maoist groups collapsed, and we started a third wave study group. We said, well, people said, well, Marxism is scientific. I said, okay, if it's scientific, let's study science, cutting edge stuff today, not the 19th century stuff. So we spent months studying chaos theory, complexity, and all this other stuff, modern physics. That we wanted to get a good idea of what science was. We came to the conclusion that John Dewey's instrumental theory of knowledge was much better than it was the dialectical materialism of the 21st century, if you really wanted to look at it in that way. It was much closer to what scientists actually did when they did science than anything that was talked about in the 19th century. So our third wave study group learned a lot from Toffler. We had a critique of Toffler, mainly its elitism, but Toffler had some very interesting ideas. And there was another guy who had a very interesting idea, was Paul Romer, political economist from California. Draw a big circle on the wall and divide it into 3. And you can put all political economy in 3 categories: hardware, software, wetware. Hardware, we all know what that is: factories, means production, all that sort of stuff. Software, we know what that is: programs, books, libraries. Wetware, what's wetware? That's software between your ears. Okay? And that problem I wrestled with in 1967. I was part of the group that put out the Port Authority Statement in 67, not part of the Praxis Project. The Port Authority Statement was meant to be the successor to the Port Huron Statement. It came up with the idea of the new working class. We were the American students of Andre Gorz. And basically, we said science and technology is going to vastly reshape the working class. The blue-collar sector is going to shrink. The service sector is going to expand. There's going to be a new sector. We call it the underclass, which is going to grow because it's pushed out of production altogether. And there's another scientific, university-trained sector, technological sector called the new working class. And it's going to grow. And our task is to find ways to unite all of them, and especially the insurgent sectors, which were then the underclass and the new working class, and find ways to connect them in our strategic thinking. Then 1968 happened, the invasion of Czechoslovakia, the offensive, the 2 assassinations, the Black Revolt, and we set all that aside and went on a long detour. But finally, by 1990, I came back to it and decided to pick it up again because it was correct. If we had stuck to that orientation, it would have been a different story. But we didn't. And there are historical reasons why you had to have been there. If you were there, you would understand why. You know, you walk outside the SDS office and you have tanks all up and down Madison Avenue with their gun turrets pointed in your window, and the city is in flames. You're not very much into debating course at the time. You're much more interested in the African American national question, or Mao, or the third world rising in revolt against the countryside of the world rising in revolt against the metropole. Those things begin to make more sense empirically. But if you go deeper, I think we were onto something, and it was worth coming back to. So our third wave study group eventually produced a book. Jerry Harris and I wrote it, called Cyber Radicalism and Roulette for a Global Age. Jerry later took it further and wrote Dialectics of Globalization, which took this theory even further. As far as the end of work questions, I'll end on those, because like I said, I could go on forever about this. The end of work stuff is all partly correct, but it's all because of a nationalist bias. What people were doing was that they were looking at the working class within the framework of a given nation. They were seeing how the blue-collar sector was shrinking in the US, which was true. But if you looked at it without those nationalist blinders, you would see on a global scale, the proletariat was growing in huge numbers. They were growing in interesting ways. Their factories were much more modern than the steel mills that were closed down where I was, but still, China went from 90% peasants to just a month ago, went to 51% workers for the first time in its history. That alone is a humongous expansion of the world proletariat right there. So there's a huge growth in the working class, just in China alone. And that second wave, so the thing about third waves is that they don't replace each other. They're all going on at the same time. There's still parts of the world that are living under the first wave. There's still parts of the world where the second wave is still expanding. And there are some countries where the third wave is emerging. And these are all simultaneous. They're not easy. They're like a hurricane. They're destructive as well as creative. And so these things are all combined in the way they operate. And I think some of the people who wrote the different, work's going to disappear very relatively quickly. We're either looking at it too narrowly or didn't see some of the interrelated contradictions. So I'll stop there.
Hi.
Oh, excuse me, one thing, first thing I am among everything else is an organizer. I put out a email.
Sorry, I'm actually filming here somewhere.
I happen to like. If you want to get it, sign it. It's very easy to press one button, and something.
Well, thank you. Good morning. How's everybody? Good. So I want to pick up on the threads that I think both Fred and Carl kind of laid out and say that, one, in full disclosure, I'm really presenting an analysis that is part of really a collective of Marxists who are also revolutionaries and view Marxism as science. And the organization that many of us are part of is the League of Revolutionaries for New America. And our organization and a predecessor organization have really been looking at this question of Marxism as science and the application of that analysis to the revolution in technology and what that means for not only work, but most importantly for capitalism, and most importantly for the situation of the working class, and how do we really transform society to bring it into line with the technology of production that increasingly displaces labor from the production process, whether it's in manufacturing or even in the service sector. So I just want to share that this has been a long, 35-year collective process, and I will try to, present it in 5 minutes as, succinctly as I can. And but also there are other, comrades here who can also help field questions. So let me just start. There's a very new article that has just been put out in Rally Comrades, and I've got a few copies for those who want it. And it just says, as early as 1975, it was possible to see how the fundamentally changed economy was creating a huge qualitatively new army of permanently unemployed, and that every technical advance made the position of the proletarians more untenable. And sort of where we have arrived, electronics, that is, electronics as the basis of computers, automation, robotics, makes it impossible for this new class, it's a new class of dispossessed workers or permanently, increasingly displaced workers, this new class to coexist with private property. Its program is communistic in the true sense of the word, each for all and all for each. So how do we go from that initial analysis to that really, for us, very powerful political conclusion, right? That this technological revolution is upending, is overturning the possibility of capitalism to continue as a system that has as its core nexus the exploitation of labor power for profit, distribution based on the wage labor system, right? Because so how we just do that analysis is actually fairly simple. The first element is that, and I can get started with it, the labor theory of value. So we still think the labor theory of value applies. And that if new value comes from labor, and labor is increasingly not part of the productive process, then there's less and less surplus value created. So there's less and less new value that can be both distributed as wage and realized as profit. This, of course, drives finance capital to speculation in fictive capital, which even Marx talked about as early as in Capital. So, I mean, that just sort of connects this relationship between the transformation of the productive process and the necessity for capital to seek other avenues, right, for actually realizing any real profit. So that is part of the crises, the increasing crises of capitalism and these speculative bubbles and the collapse, starting in the 70s and 80s and then most recently in 2007, and the inability of economies to continue to operate. On the side of, it also means it's very difficult to circulate commodities, right? Because if more and more workers are displaced and workers are 2/3 of the consumers, right, in a global economy, then that's also part of the crisis of the collapse of the circulation process. On the side of the worker, okay, and that's where I'm going to go, because we see this process as creating a necessarily revolutionary process in society, in a new class of displaced labor that has to overturn the existing class relations and the state in order to survive. So if we are increasingly unemployed and underemployed, and I think that that's really clear, right? That the whole discussion of the post-industrial society or the third wave or the new wave and so forth and so on, that I think that those things are real. I think what people who looked at the technological displacement of labor believed was that there would be new jobs created, right, to replace the old jobs. And our assessment is that this is one process, right? If you look at the process of industrialization, it occurred over a series of about 300 years, okay? Manufacturing. I mean, from manufacturing to industry, and it spread around the world. So I don't think we can actually say that, electronic production, which began in the mid-1900s, right? Last century, mid of last century, that we really have seen the whole process of it, because there's still a lot of people working, right? So we aren't saying that there's absolutely no labor that's employed, but if we are looking at the process, right? This process, this revolutionary process of how new technologies are increasingly introduced, not only to, the industrial manufacturing sector, but to the service sector, right? Intellectual labor is being displaced. Service sector labor, healthcare labor, retail sale labor. So labor across the entire economy, communications labor, right, is increasingly being displaced. So we see this as a process that capital must continue to do, even though it turns the contradiction between capital and labor over, how do we distribute this new value, it turns it into an antagonism. It essentially breaks the nexus that once we are increasingly unemployed, right, our tie to capital is broken, then we are no longer arguing or fighting with capital over the question of the social wage, right, or the question of hours and wages and benefits, but we are then left without a job, without the access to housing, food, shelter, healthcare, and education, so that this process increasingly turns our economic battles that we had into political battles, right? If you are underemployed, if you are a contingent worker that all of a sudden gets laid off at the university and you can't find another job, then what do? You end up in maybe Zuccotti Park, you might end up as part of the Occupy movement, but you are then part of this class of dispossessed. So our understanding of this kind of new class or new working class is that it actually comes from all strata of society, that the displacement of labor with electronic, automated, robotized, digitized production and distribution affects professional technical workers, intellectual workers, healthcare workers, as well as factory workers. And so we are seeing this pressure on all of us of displacement from wage labor in whatever sector of the economy it is. And it is creating this huge, huge crisis of, one, circulation of capital because we don't have money, but it's also creating a crisis for us of survival. We also see the destruction of the safety net, right? The welfare state, as a clear reflection of capital's decision to say we no longer need labor. Labor that falls out of production is not coming back. That we are really superfluous and redundant increasingly within the capitalist system of production. And so that is creating a pressure on capital to say, how can the state benefit capital? And so the safety net is a wasteful use of dollars, right? Much better to give welfare to the banks and to Wall Street than to give welfare to the underemployed. So I guess sort of is time up?
You have a minute or two.
Okay, so I guess in conclusion, the argument we are making is that this is a revolutionary process, that the displacement of labor from production is undermining the historic relations of capital and labor, of both exploitation of labor and development of surplus value. And it's also undermining the process of capital to continue to circulate commodities, right, without wages in the aggregate. And that it's then incumbent, right, upon that class of humanity that needs to work for a living and that cannot get a wage that is a sustainable wage, to really organize politically as a force to transform society. The final point is that technological production is the most productive form of production, right? Which means there's an abundance. And so that abundance of everything is really what makes it possible to realize a cooperative and egalitarian society. It is really shortage and scarcity that creates fighting and conflict and struggle. So that not only do you have the technological displacement, but the technological production creates more than what people actually, need, more than enough. So that it's also the basis for a cooperative egalitarian society. And it just takes, political organization and consciousness of that to create that reality.
So I thought I'd give you each a few minutes to respond to each other, especially in the spirit of provoking some debate and discussion, anything that you might have heard that you might take issue with or disagree with. And I guess to touch things off, I wanted to try to specify two areas. The first would again be Marx and Marxism, and how this bears upon these technological transformations. For example, George, in your critique of Negri and Rifkin, you emphasized the fact that Marx saw technological progress is bound up with the gains of the organized working class, that in a way it is, you could say, the labor movement that necessitates the implementation of labor-saving technologies. So what I find interesting then is that, Fred, you described the shift away in innovation from Fortune 500 companies to this kind of secret system, quasi-secret, quasi-informal, disorganized system of state subsidization, even and especially under Reagan in the 1980s. And at the same time, this is a period of sort of, as everyone sort of discusses, this is occurring, automation, cybernetics, robotics, during the time of sort of historic breaks in working class gains, in the rollback of the welfare state, which has interesting implications then for this idea that it is the gains of the working class that motivate progress. And then finally, there are some issues over whether or not the labor theory of value still applies, and what that would mean in the context of all of this, including global proletarianization that has increased over these decades. So I guess that's one question that I think there might be some disagreement between some of you that seems sort of foundational. So I'd like you to just respond to each other to that, anything you like.
Okay. Yeah, I have a number of points. First, just a kind of Marxological point. Of course, in my political development, I sort of began close to where you were, well, maybe a few years later. I was involved in the journal called Zero World, which in the mid-70s. And it had a theme that comes directly out of Marx's Grundrisse, the fragment of machines, which was, if you're not familiar with it, you'll have to check out those prized 20, 25 pages of the Grundrisse, of his notebooks, basically, which he largely worked on in 1858. Now, one thing that I've noticed in my studies of Marx is that those much quoted lines really are not developed by Marx in this later work. I mean, remember, Marx publishes Capital Volume 1 in 1867, roughly a decade later, and in that decade, Marx did a lot of work. Okay, as we now know, and in that writing, especially when you look at Volume 1, 2, and 3 of Capital, you don't find development of the theme that we find in the news. And it's sort of surprising if it was if it had been a kind of major conception that Marx wanted to hold on to. I think it would have entered into one of the volumes, especially volume 3 of Capital. So I generally see in my work in my studies of Marx, I basically have been arguing that Marx did not develop any of the explosion, so to speak, of the labor theory of that he describes. And that, in fact, he develops another theme, which you can find again in this, unfortunately, Marx's writings in volume 2 and 3 are very dense and are very difficult at times to follow. But in that long section concerning the issue of the transformation of values and prices, what we find is another conception that Marx was developing in terms of the future of capital. not that the labor theory of value would go into crisis and be basically abolished by the development of the application of science. But actually, what would happen would be that as capital, in response to many issues, including the struggle of the working class, in its increasing, basically, density of capital in use in the production process, in the development of science and technology in the production process, basically the rate of profit would begin to decline. And there would be this tendency that we find of basically the rate of profit. And the only way to counter, he argued that this was counteracted by the capitalist system by a number of factors. One factor, for example, that's very important is the development of low technological industries, which would, in effect, make it possible for there to be, basically an exploitation of labor in industries that, instead of being very highly organically composed, there's a lot of constant capital labor, the development of industries that were exactly the opposite, and that this would, in effect, begin to counteract the effect of the increasing employment of science and technology and basically constant capital in one part of the capitalist system. So this, I think, was Marx's mature conception of the general tendency of where capital is going. And that I basically do not think that Marx's final view on the matter was the view that he develops in the interesting. Okay. I'd just like to make just a couple of other points here. I think that this view that I'm arguing for in terms of the interpretation of Marx is a good one. And I think that, in fact, it can be the developments that we've seen since the 1980s in terms of the way in which this vast amount of labor has been absorbed by the capitalist system from China, Eastern Europe, many parts of Africa, South America, after the neoliberal globalization, which has been a process that has, in effect, driven millions and millions of workers into the labor market. In fact, one would say the madness for capital to operate in these structural adjustment and closure processes if it was unable to create a situation where much of this labor could be exploited. So I think that that's important, and I think we have to distinguish between the function of unemployment. It's not just, it's part of the struggle that goes on around wages, right? If it's not just simply a sign of the fact that capitalism is presumably leading to a place where workers are dispensable, but in fact it leads to a situation where workers' wages will be low. And of course, I think when I look at the situation of Europe at this very moment, let's say Greece, for example, I'm Greek American and I have many family members in Greece, and I see what's going on with people there. It's clear what's happening. The high level of unemployment has made it possible to drive down wages, drive down the living conditions, and it seems very clear to me that this has been the function of employment. And the final point I want to make is that let's be careful about the issue of employment, jobs versus worth. Most of the work that goes on in capitalist society does not go on under the rubric of a job. I think that that's something that there's been a kind of theoretical revolution around this issue, not only in Marxism, but all forms of thinking about work that have been transformed in the last 25 years. That we now begin to understand that there's a tremendous amount of work that doesn't operate according to the official contractual relations that we have associated with employee work. And just one final thing. I think that unfortunately, and here's a bit of experience that I had with zero work and with these views concerning work and so on in the 1970s and 80s, is that there is a desire, a political desire, to locate the vulnerabilities of capital within capital itself. Increasingly, I begin to see that the major problem of revolution is not capital, it is within the working class itself, and especially within its divisions. And if we cannot deal with those divisions, the possible weaknesses of capital are not going to be very valuable to us. So these are some of the.
Okay, so yeah, I think I'll try to sharpen some of these differences here. I agree with the last point that you made about the importance of the divisions, but I come at it from a different direction, and I guess I should start by admitting that I don't consider myself a Marxist. I mean, I came out of a Marxist intellectual trajectory, but so the fact that Marx had these insights in the Grundrisse that didn't get incorporated into his later work doesn't bother me. In other words, he was a very smart man, and we should take what was really valuable in his thinking. And so to me, that it seems pretty obvious that the labor theory of value is kind of reduced to nothing when you're talking about a highly automated factory, and there are 3 workers, and they push the switch, and the machines start running, and that their labor power is paid for in the first 3 nanoseconds, and the rest of the time is surplus labor. I mean, it's a kind of reductio ad absurdum. But I want to kind of push a little bit beyond that, that I think that really the other part of the Marxist legacy that's no longer helpful here is the infrastructure of class analysis itself. That this transformations in the nature of production have changed the way in which social divisions work. And this, it seems to me, is the great contribution of Occupy Wall Street, is this idea of the 99% against the 1% is a very powerful metaphor for essentially saying the vast, vast majority of the population is being screwed by this very small segment of an oligarchy that are unjustly appropriating these vast amounts of resources through their control over these financial institutions or these giant corporations. So I kind of keep thinking of that if we want a metaphor for contemporary capitalism, I don't even like the word capitalism, I have to admit that, but we should think about Facebook. In other words, that the productive forces, the technological capacity, have developed to this point where a bunch of software designers could establish this platform. I have to confess I'm an old guy and I don't do Facebook myself, but I know other people who do. But they create this platform where people are engaged in this collective leisure activity, of social connection, which can also be used, as we've seen, for political purposes, for building connections, for building social movements, for all kinds of different purposes. And yet, here is this kind of contradiction of the 1% and the 99%, that the hundreds of millions of users of Facebook, they're putting not their labor time, but their leisure time into producing the content for this website. And here's, Mr. Zuckerberg and the, handful of other people at the top of the organization. There's an IPO coming up, and the expectation is that Facebook will be valued at something like $100 billion. And that overnight, Zuckerberg, who's already a billionaire because he sold shares earlier, will be up there in Bill Gates land in terms of how much money. So I think that what we need is, in a sense, to build on these, to move beyond these old Marxist ideas, understand that we've reached this technological stage where the production process, the advance of technology, the advance of society can go on without without the 1%. We can figure out ways to reorganize that are in the interests of the vast of that 99%. That's kind of the path I want to open.
I'll take a couple of things. One, I think you can take Facebook and Bill Gates and all of that and use Marx to explain it, and if I had a half an hour, I would get up there and blackboard and do it for you. But I don't. Believe me. It's true. You don't have to discard Marx to understand Bill Gates. And by the way, the problem with Bill Gates is not that he's made all that money. The problem is with the tax system that allows him to keep it.
It's also the technology sector.
Right. Surplus value, is it shrinking? Malden made this point. No. It's slightly different. I don't know if you meant to say that, but I would disagree. Surplus value is growing in large amounts. What is declining is the rate of profit, not surplus value itself. There's tremendous amounts of surplus value being done in Detroit right now. It's expanding, but what is declining in Detroit is the rate of profit. It's the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Why does Marx use tendency? Because there are counter tendencies at the same time. At the same time that old industries are being either destroyed or the ratio of organic capital is growing, high automation, high degree of automation. There are whole new fields. Every one of you probably has a cell phone. 15 years ago, these didn't exist as an industry. We still had those old things where you had the dial or even push buttons. But a lot of you guys in here are what I call the net gen. You've never existed in a time when there wasn't an internet. Me, I'm back in the pre-TV. I'm a radio guy. So I understand the enormous amounts that just came off of this. This is part of that. That's why Marx uses the word tendency, because there are counter tendencies. And maybe it's because I'm a working class guy, but I think we got a ways to go before we get abundance. One of the first things we'll need is what Bucky Fuller called the smart grid globally. You know what it takes to build a smart grid? It takes enormous amounts of labor. The old-fashioned kind, as well as the new-fashioned kind, to build the smart grid. It's a mechanic, it's metal towers and underground cables and enormous amounts of computers, and you want to link it across the entire globe. That takes enormous expansion of the working class just to build that damn thing. And it will take decades, under ideal conditions of socialism, to build it. And without it, you are not going to have abundance in a true sense on a global scale. That's just one thing. We won't even get into, solar power, wave power, all the geothermal, all of that stuff that we have to grow, the tremendous amounts of things there has to be a vast expansion of forces to get where we're going to be, and that includes a vast expansion. So, okay, that's number one. The question of the social wage. It's precisely the people who are pushed out of production that the social wage becomes crucial for. What they lose is the actual wage that they gain in a factory, the wage labor for their labor. But the social wage becomes even more important because once you're thrown permanently out of production, it's the social wage that you survive on. We had this debate back in 1967. We had Up Against the Wall motherfucker here from Hell's Kitchen, the faction at SDS. And some of us put out the slogan, jobs are income now. Ben Murray and his anarchists attacked it. They said, we don't need jobs, income now. Because we're all going to be pushed out of production. So just to see what he was saying was we need the social wage, not the wage labor wage, but the social wage, the support that people need when they are pushed out of production, or they're doing work for which there's no market. If you're teaching young people basketball in the park, you're creating value, but it's not in the market. But in a social wage, you could be compensated for that, or for raising children, or things like that. So that's where the social wage becomes relevant. Once you're pushed out, it doesn't become irrelevant, it becomes even more relevant once you're pushed out of production. My answer to Ben Murray is, I told him he was a reformist and went halfway. I said, income now. I said, why don't you just abolish money and do it and go to all the food direction altogether? I said, your problem is that you're still clinging to the money. But, that's in the far distant future. We won't even talk about that at this moment. But that's what I meant about, emancipate your minds when it comes to Marx. A lot of this stuff, Marx was a brilliant guy. He wrote all kinds of stuff. He was writing to the day he died, and he would never finish it all. Capital is an unfinished work. So it doesn't surprise me at all that certain things themes aren't developed or anything. That's just because of the limitations, Mother Earth puts on us. We all return to it sooner than we like, But I think if you want to understand capitalism, you have to study it, man. There's no way around it.
This is a sign-up list for Call's newsletter.
Okay. So I just wanted to answer this one last sort of point about the question of what happens to those of us that are pushed out of production around the social wage. I'm not saying, what I'm saying is that, capitalist relations exist within the capitalist state. And if we look at the reality of what has happened to whether we call it the safety net, whether we call it social democracy, or whether we call it the social wage, it has basically been eviscerated, right? Am I crazy or, And so I think the point is at a certain stage of development, we were a reserve army of labor, right? In other words, there was a point at which we would be unemployed for a period of time, and then as markets expanded, we would be pulled back into employment. And the social wage was one because one of the struggle of labor, but also because capital understood that somebody had to pay for the cost, right? And they said the state should pay for it, not capital directly. And that the destruction of the social wage is precisely because those of us that are increasingly and underemployed are not going to be pulled back into production. That when the economy expands into quote-unquote new markets, the production and the service sector are going to be doing that with a much more efficient, technologically and electronically efficient mode of production and distribution. So that we are not a reserve army of labor, we are a increasingly permanently un- and underemployed section of humanity. And that the real struggle is for us to reorganize society in a cooperative way. There was one other thing about the 99%. We would argue that the 99% are not only very pissed off, right, about the bailout of the financial sector and Wall Street, but that they are also beginning to feel this crisis, primarily the most privileged section of the working class, white guys, okay? And that they were in professional and technical jobs, a lot of them have degrees, and increasingly they are finding that they cannot get a job that is going to pay them enough to both pay back their student loans as well as to survive in the way in which they thought that they would. So, so we would argue that the crisis of the uprisings around the world, including the 99%, is this reflection of the destruction of this system of you get an education and then you go to work and live happily ever after. So that it's really a reflection of this revolution that is taking place in the technological sector and what is happening to wage labor.
Great. Well, I think now we can open up for questions. So,
well, this is like a fascinating panel, so thanks so much. I have 4 questions. I'm going to go through them super quickly. You can answer one or all of them if you want. The first question is about the question of organization. So I think that the idea coming out of autonomous theory of class composition and the way in which class composition has changed along with the sort of organic composition of capital and increases in technology has led Hart and Negri to try to use this idea of multitude to describe the way in which we organize and understand the working class subject in an information age. And it's obviously been, I think, somewhat unsuccessful, so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the idea of organization and how we organize the working class in an era of, you were saying, simultaneous waves and modes of production and also simultaneous class subjects. And then the second thing I was wondering about was the idea of the question of the capture and innovation and technology, and so the ways in which, again, post-autonomous or later autonomous theorists have talked about technologies creating the sort of spontaneous or laboring in an industrial information era, creating the conditions for a spontaneous and elementary communism. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the way capital and the state also seek to seize and capture those innovations and use them for generation of profit. I'm kind of thinking specifically about the way the National Research Council in Canada, which was previously an autonomous scientific and technological research agency funded by the government, has now been told that it should focus all of its science and technological research on business and how to innovate for the purposes of business and capital. The third thing I wanted to ask about was connected to this, the way technologies have their own politics and the ways in which these politics then can contribute to a normalization of relations that exist under capitalism. And here I was sort of thinking specifically about something I'm really interested in research, this artificial nose that's being developed by DARPA to use to create chemical cartographies and sniff out and create ground truth maps of the chemical composition of environments and neighborhoods. It's supposed to be used as a device for sniffing out terrorism, but also I think simultaneously creates a sort of ground truth of environmental destruction and normalizes environmental destruction in environments. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk a tiny bit about that. And then the fourth thing I just wanted to note was this question of technology versus workers. One thing I've noticed is that, yes, increasing technology allows us to produce in cheaper and cheaper ways, but because of this sort of tendency of the rate of profit to fall, sometimes actually using human labor becomes cheaper than technology. And I thought maybe just to think about that a little bit and talk about that.
Well, those are very fruitful questions. Turn over to our panelists.
I'll take one on organization. It's one of my favorite things these days. It's the only weapon we have. When you really get down to it. Bourgeoisie, they have the CIA, FBI, the Army, Navy, all that hardware, whatnot, firepower. I'll tell you a story about organization. Some of you may have heard this story before, so just bear with it. Many of you probably haven't. It's a story about Savannah Baum, the Red Prince of Laos. He was a communist. He was in the royal family, but he led the power to fight against the French. French captured him one time, put him in prison. Finally, in Vientiane, the capital of the French authorities, so drove him to Savannah Baum and put him on trial. They went out to the prison. There was no one there. Savannah Baum first organized all the prisoners. Then he organized all the guards. Then he organized the warden. And they all walked away from the prison off to the liberated zones. That's the power of organization. That's what the working class has. How do we organize? Every which way. Every which way. We have to organize politically, we have to organize culturally, we have to organize economically, we have to build organizations to contend for power, build the counter-hegemonic bloc, every which way. The new one that I've been promoting for the last couple of years is the solidarity economy. It's a way of contending with the bourgeoisie in the economic sphere. Most of the left is very good about contending in the cultural sphere, rock and roll, all sorts of things. Contending in the political sphere, we debate over different political formations, third parties, this kind of party, revolutionary parties. I think we need when you talk the economic sphere, people's eyes tend to glaze over. When you start talking about the left, about building businesses, even cooperative and their own ones, they get a headache. Some of them do. Increasingly large numbers of young people coming largely out of the anarcho-syndicalist trend are becoming more interested in it, and some out of the NGOs. So that's a new form of organization. We need all of these forms of organization to build what I call the points of power within the war of position, because that's strategically where we are now. We are in the defensive mode, the strategic defensive of the war of position. That doesn't mean we don't have tactical wars of movement now and then. But to use Chomsky's thing, we are in war position right now, and we have to build our strength. And the only way we build our strength is by building organizations. If you go into a battle better organized than, if you come out of a battle better organized than you went into it, you have won. Even if your candidate was defeated, even if your strike was lost, if you come out of it better organized than when you went into it, you have won. Because that's the key thing that we need strategically. So if all of you guys consider yourself socialists, and you're not a member of an actual socialist organization, you got the wrong idea. You can't be a socialist by yourself. It's no fun, number one, and it doesn't work. You have to build a socialist organization. I'm tired of people saying, we got to build a movement. Of course we got to build a movement. Movements are like waves, they come and go. The real question is, does organization building trump movement building, even as they are connected? And the answer is yes. Organization building trumps movement building, even as they are connected. Write that down, because that is very important.
And I'm wondering if you could also, if I could ask you, Fred, to sort of address the question in terms of the state's development in Canada around research. Why this sort of relates to my earlier question. Why do you think these types of research and development shifts are taking place within various states across the world?
Well, I mean, I think the simple way of saying it is that that the technologies have become sufficiently complicated, cutting across 3, 4, 5, 6 different scientific engineering disciplines, that even the largest firms can't afford to have laboratories that have 6 different types of research scientists. They have to create career lines for each of them. It just becomes too costly, and the knowledge and techniques are too widely diffused. So that everything is kind of moving in this direction of open science. So like with the Human Genome Project, they had people working on it, around the country, and they posted their results, what they had decoded at the end of each day. That accelerates the process. I mean, making the scientific enterprise more collective, more communal, accelerates it. So what we're seeing is this kind of networked forms of technological development, not occurring within one organization, but across organizations. And within that system, government has to play a central role, both as funding and as in terms of being an honest broker, making the networks work, because since it's a market-oriented system, all the private players want to appropriate the intellectual property as quickly as they can, and so the government role is trying to keep people playing fair with each other and keeping the process going, postponing the day in which they divide up the fruits. So, but the point is that it is one of these fundamental contradictions that the private appropriation of profit, of intellectual property, constantly threatens this collective bottom-up development of science and technology. And that we know the big corporations now have these mountains of patents which they use for defensive purposes, because when they infringe on somebody else's patent, they pull out this list and say, well, you can't sue us, we have 47 of our patents that you've infringed on, and then they negotiate a deal. So I think that it's a sphere of contradiction, just as the development of the sniffing technologies, the surveillance technologies, the threats to our privacy, just again from Facebook and the net. I mean, all of these are more of these contradictions between this the way the productive forces are developing and this systems of private power, and that they're all organizing opportunities, as Carl, in Carl's terms. I mean, that the system itself can't manage these contradictions. People have to fight back and essentially exercise their power to control the fruits of these technologies.
Yeah, just a couple of comments about questions. One thing that, in terms of organization, one of the most important transformations that have taken place in the last 20, 30 years has been the issue of organizing on the job and the recognition that organizing around the job has become extremely difficult in the United States, for sure. And that has led to the recognition that more and more of us, that the site of organization is not necessarily going to have to be on the job. And in fact, the Occupy movement is really an expression of that. It now turns out that unions go to the Occupy movement to have assistance for their own negotiations. I mean, we've seen this happen a number of times, especially in the West Coast around the longshoremen's negotiations. But this is also true in a way of what happened anteceding the Occupy story is, of course, the Wisconsin story of last winter's early spring, where in fact the civil servants unions, the faculty unions, and so on, turned to basically a large part of the population that were not civil servants and that were not university teachers to defend their rights. And this is now, so in a way, what this landscape is showing is how, in fact, capital has control on the workplace. At least certainly in the United States, that's for sure. And there's so I would just want to bring up that point. I think also, I just want to respond to the issue of capture as a term that has been used, a term of the art in a way, that's now been used by a segment of, I suppose, autonomous Marxists and perhaps others like yourself, if I heard you use that term. It's a term that I can understand and I can sympathize with, but on the other side, it gives us an image which I find really a little problematic. There's the image of these technologically sophisticated workers operating on a particular task and sort of autonomously developing ideas to their cooperation. And then sort of outside the sphere of capital. And then somehow it's at the door once these concepts are fully developed, that capital steps in and captures the value that has been produced in this operation. And it strikes me when I look at the actual production of things that I've watched a film being done outside my window in Brooklyn, and I realized that the film apparently is an immaterial object, right? But when you actually see what it takes to put on a film, okay, is tremendous amount of machines, workers, and actors of all sorts, and so on. You begin to realize that what's going on is not so much a free development of thoughts and cooperative insights, but what we're actually seeing is a task work. Okay, and I think it's important. Often we don't see that task work is also a form of. It's measured by time, but it's measured by time in the sense of not only the actual physical time, you might say, but social time, and it's as discipline. The problem is that often these technologists are very self-disciplined. They've incorporated into themselves so much of capital that in fact they actually are in fact actually produce the type of work that is crucial within the time period that is required by their employers. So yes, I appreciate your point that the working class, however, has been pretty creative over the hundreds of years that it's been in existence. So the creativity that we see in the making of these machines is important. But I think that the problem is that although the working class is very creative, it's also is still under tremendous discipline at this point in history. And maybe your sniffer things are not only sniffing outside, but also sniffing the sniffer makers. So be careful of that. So,
just quickly, so let me just speak also, I think, to this question of the composition of the working class and how they're organized. I've been very involved in the world in the U.S. social forum process, and it's brought together many, many different working class actors who don't, identify, as they're not part of the union movement or whatever. So there's been a whole section of excluded workers, right? That is very casual contingent workers, domestic workers, day laborers, and so forth, who've actually begun organizing as excluded workers and as these international alliances of domestic and day laborers. Housing is a huge struggle, from the shack dwellers of South Africa to the homeless in the States, right? So people are organizing around, they're part of the working class, but they're really organizing around their basic needs. And these are actually large national and international movements. Particularly indigenous have led huge struggles around water, nature, and the destruction of nature. Again, part of the working class, but not, organizing against an employer, but around necessities of life and going really to the state, right? I mean, it's a struggle against the state for how they are going to get these necessities and under what conditions. So I think that is a huge part of what the new organization looks like. The whole question of technology and warfare and surveillance is just a whole other huge sphere of discussion of technology changing production, communication, warfare, and literally, right, new technologies, literally changing every dimension of social being.
Okay, we have about 20 minutes left, so I want to ask everyone to ask just one question. Please keep your questions brief. And panelists, if you choose to respond,
maybe collect like three or four.
Yeah, we can do two at a time. In the back.
Most of the panel chose to look at these issues through a Marxist theoretical lens, and most contemporary people are not embedded in that, including most contemporary intellectuals, apart from those that are heavily identified with the left. Yet I think there is, or also the question of whether this is being driven as a historical inevitable. But I think there is hope for pushing these issues because of what is prominent among contemporary people, and that is First, lingering unemployment continues at a very high rate. People are also feeling a great deal of time pressure. The rise of these technologies has created new hobbies. People want to spend time with their Facebook and their email, and they don't need to fit this into their lives. People want to do homeschooling, new forms of leisure. There are people want to go to bohemian festivals, Burning Man, this kind of thing. Technology has also made a lot of wealth very shareable. Either things where you can go to flea markets nowadays and DVDs are approaching $1 a piece, and that's under contemporary copyright, whereas it could all be accessible for free on a server somewhere, and you'd have all as much leisure time that anyone would want to put into that. And yet somehow this issue hasn't really become part of the contemporary debate. I tried to push as much as I could at Occupy Wall Street. I had a number of 4-day work week posters and things like that there, and yet it doesn't seem to have really caught on. Like I don't know what's holding it back.
Thank you.
I wonder whether we can just reflect a little bit on this Facebook example, just to understand the relation between unemployment, underemployment, technology. It seems to me Facebook was started with the intention of making money. The users of Facebook, through their leisure, then become monetized. And that's the source of the profits and the IPO and all the rest of it. That is to say, the work being done, are these people working class in as much as they produce the source of profits for Facebook through advertising? So the question of, you could imagine an entirely unemployed or underemployed population using technologies like the Facebook, and thus being permanently underemployed, unemployed, but nevertheless contributing to profits. And it seems to me, whatever one talks about in terms of horizontal modes of organization, collaboration, etc., focusing on the Facebook example might help me understand better the relation between technology, underemployment on the one hand, source of profits, and labor value on the other.
So we have the prospects for politicizing a shorter working week in the present and the Facebook question. Would anyone like to respond?
The Facebook question, when I first saw Facebook, I said, this is interesting. These guys have come up with online yellow pages where everybody can do advertisements for themselves. So I immediately signed up and started advertising all my political projects. But Facebook is media, and media makes its money by, there's 3 ways you can make money with media. You sell ads, you have a rich person, you're a rich person's hobby, or it's a charity. Those are the 3 ways they make money. Facebook makes money by selling ads, and you contribute to their selling ads either by responding to one of their ads or bringing new people to respond to one of their ads. It's different than Microsoft, it'd take a long time to explain it. But as a site, it allows many social communication with visuals. And it doesn't cost anything for people to do it. You pay by giving them your information, not by giving them your money. So that is the value you add. You give them information about you that they can then segment into markets and sell those markets, sell those ads to those markets, and so on. So that's how it makes. That's the short answer. But there's much longer one that we don't have.
Well, I guess I would say that it is a bit more than that. I mean, because it's not just Facebook alone; it's these games, the online virtual games and so forth. I mean, it's a whole social world being created, and it is the appropriation not of surplus labor time, but of surplus leisure time as a mode of making profit. So it does seem to me that it points to the broader tensions that I've been trying to get at. But let me just say something about the 4-day work week question. I mean, I guess the one concept which hasn't come up in this discussion that I think is really critical for all of this is the idea of false necessity. I mean, I agree with Carl that abundance, whatever that might be, is way off. It's a few centuries away. But we live under a system of false necessity, that the existing system is claiming, we have to tighten our belts, we have to deal with budget cuts in the public sector and more hours of work and less pay and so forth. And the whole point of the technological argument is that these claims are false, that in fact the productive forces have advanced. We have the objective basis for a fairer, more just society, which can provide for everybody, not just here, but globally. And so the real idea, the real point is that we are bombarded on a daily basis by these claims of false necessity and the discipline of the social relations. And I agree that these technologists are, being disciplined by big business. I mean, that the point is that we are subject to this discipline in all spheres of our lives, in the workplace, outside of the workplace. They were controlled by these claims of false necessity. And the point is to convey that these claims are false, that things don't have to be that way, that we can penetrate this and challenge this ideology. I mean, that's the point I'm trying to make.
I just, okay, if I may put it in the form of a slogan, the major scarcity of the working class faces is the scarcity of power. Because let's take the work week we were talking about. If the trends concerning the reduction of the work week roughly between 1890 and the 1940s continued, basically not only would we have had a 4-day work week, but I think I don't remember the last calculation, but it would be about 2.5 day work week. So the question is, why did it stop? Which is what happened in terms of working class power, that the ability to reduce the work week, which Marx in Volume 3 sees as the basis, the entrance to the realm of freedom. Discuss view. And maybe it is the deep-seated recognition of that defeat roughly took place somewhere at the end of the Second World War in the early 50s. That defeat, and there have been various theories about the reasons for that. That defeat is now into very deeply in our bones. So perhaps a lot of people who look at the 4-day work week are now feeling so overwhelmed and oppressed that it becomes not a viable option, not a viable slogan to work.
And yet it seems to sidestep the capitalist versus communist debate, because you could still have capitalism under a 4-day work week, and I think a lot of mainstream people would like that, and they might not come to identify as being as left as we are, but they would want that. They, whether they want more time for this, or they want more time for their kids, or doing yoga, or whatever.
Is that the way to get a word in? Is to just start talking? I'm just wondering.
I'll get to
Maybe just
Make some time for another round of questions.
Just one other. Okay, good point that you made.
Sorry.
Just wanted to say that, of course, the power of a slogan is not only because it's very catchy, but also it picks up a possibility. And this is something that we have to face now, is that there is a very deep recognition of the limitations of power that working classes in our part of the world are facing. And I know from the Greek story that the Greeks have been fighting in the streets for the last 2.5 years and have not been able to change what has happened. So it's a very deep story. I just want to make one small point about what appears as a technological issue, but actually it's the way in which capital has operated to bring together unwaged work from within a family, within a community, and there are very many different techniques to do it, to suck up unwaged work and transform it into basically exchange value. How is that to be done? We know in a family the tremendous amount of unwaged labor that goes into bringing up children, and how that's transformed into basically the creation of the commodity labor power that is transformed into surplus value, to use the old categories, but not. So and this is not a new phenomenon. It's just that in a way this is taking place using technological means, but it's done in many other ways as well, and it's very important to understand it because it's very insidious. It's Facebook.
Well, did you want to respond, or should we go?
No.
I would actually like to respond to something he said and something that Carl said earlier. Two things. One is this whole question, it's interesting about how the trade union movement developed and what it's doing now. Because the trade union movement developed as a working class organization, meaning that it didn't just represent its members, it represented the working class. And the big strategic compromise that the trade unions made in that period between the end of World War II and the 1950s is that it made the decision to represent its members and not be a working class organization. And the bourgeois made that a very attractive compromise because they said if you represent your members and not the working class, we will reward you with constant expansion of wages and health care and all that. That was a strategic mistake that they're now paying for. They've been paying for from the 70s on. And I just think that's a very important thing. They're going back to their roots. They're not starting something new by looking to Wall Street or looking to the community. They're trying to get back to their roots of being a working class organization. On this question of surplus value and expansion or not expansion, it's interesting. I'm an ex-auto worker, and so I really look at it from that perspective. And the way I understand the labor theory of value is fundamentally that labor is the only commodity that creates an added value in the process of production. That only human beings, through their labor, actually create new value. And when I look at what's happening in the technological world, it seems to me that, my example is the auto industry. In the plant that I worked in Detroit, we had 3,000 workers back in the 70s. And today that same plant has less than 200 workers, and they produce more commodities than we did with 3,000 workers. Now what that means to me is that each one of those commodities have less value in it because there are fewer and fewer workers producing them. So it's a small amount of value, but because the technological revolution has revolutionized production and productivity is so high, that limited amount of value, that reduction in value, when it's multiplied by billions of commodities, creates a additional surplus value, but not value. And that's to me is the question that I thought Waldo was getting at really, is that value is decreasing. And the reason that's important, and I'll end here, the reason that's important is because this whole contradiction between labor and capital is the fundamental contradiction of the capitalist system. And capital, I think the problem with the introduction of this high technology is not just that it's destroying the labor side of that contradiction, but it's also destroying the capital side of the contradiction. Meaning that capital depends on labor to work and to create that value that it needs for its profit. And by buying back the commodities that it produces. And so the more and more labor that gets expelled from this contradiction, the less and less people there are to buy back those commodities because they don't have the money to do it. And therefore, the whole side of capital is also being destroyed. And so I don't know if we're saying something different, Carol, but I just thought
We're not saying something different.
Okay.
We're just arguing over relative and absolute.
Okay.
And I'll make one more question before we respond on panel.
I just wanted to push, I'm sorry I missed the beginning, so forgive me if this was said already. I just wanted to push one more time on sort of the politics though, and especially the relationship of this panel and the people on the panel, what they see in relation to Occupy. Because it's been mentioned, several times it's been mentioned that Occupy is this new hope, it's people organizing outside the workplace because, whatever, the repression in the workplace is so draconian, or it's, a new form of democratic politics. But it seems to me that, it does seem to me that there are fundamental differences between, organizing around, to put it in very traditional terms, the contradiction between the forces and the relations of production, organizing around like the potential for people to stop working, and organizing around, you know, the contradiction between the rich and the poor, the 99% versus the 1%. And it seems to me that, you know, in a way, like, Occupy is still very open, but it seems to me that very classically, the contradiction between the rich and poor, like, can be ameliorated by several measures, like, including, like, you know, state intervention, including, you know, the attempt to move the Democratic Party, like, slightly to the left, maybe one of these days. And so, it does seem to me that, like, the actual, like, to take really seriously kind of what you guys are talking about, these kind of deep tendencies in the capitalist economy, that one would have to really sort of argue for a certain kind of, like, perspective and program in, you know, an incipient radical movement like Occupy or whatever, that was like, the contradiction between the rich and the poor is actually in a way, like, less important to organize around or subsidiary to the contradiction between the relations and forces of production, that sort of issue. So I'm just curious what you see as sort of like what, it seems to me there's a program to fight for, rather than a sense that, you know, Occupy is just wonderful because it's so fresh and new, et cetera. Based on your insights,
I think Occupy Wall Street is, a very short answer. I think Occupy Wall Street is essentially an initial expression of a popular front against finance capital. Finance capital is the target of Wall Street. And popular front, it's multi-class. It has a whole variety of interests. It's not just one class. Its core is a bunch of stressed young workers, generally young workers in particular. But it involves lots of other. That's why it's a popular front. And it's aimed at finance capital. It has a lot of demands, but the best demand that it raises against finance capital is the financial transaction tax, because that actually expropriates a chunk of surplus value and puts it back to certain needs. So it's an interesting critical force. I think the most important thing for it to do is to seek mass allies beyond itself, the trade unions, the community organizations, and so on, and keep fighting. It's not crowded anywhere. You know, you don't have to create a hierarchy of targets. Just pick one and start fighting, and keep fighting. You know, it's not crowded up front.
Yeah, just one short point. One of the most important experiences that the Occupy movement has learned has been the divisions within the 99%. And I think it has been part of all the major and minor sites of organization that has been brought up again and again, is the tension, racial tensions, gender tensions, also tensions between those who have a regular job versus those who don't in this society. It's been the recognition of those divisions and how to deal with them that is, it seems to me, if there's a revolutionary aspect of the Occupy movement, it's there. It's that, not that there's been any solution to these issues, but there has been a very deep confrontation with them, and especially with the issue of the development of the relationship between so-called homeless and the rest of the Occupy movement.
I'd just say very quickly that, you know, picking up on the case of Greece, you know, which is kind of the extreme example of the 1% against the 99%, that if you think of that it's simultaneously the wealthy versus everybody else, but it's also the forces of production versus the relations of production. In other words, what would we be fighting for if we were in Greece? It seems to me very obvious that one has to fight for the creation of that solidarity economy from the bottom up, that the only option is to build those jobs through cooperatives, through pooling together, through developing from the bottom up an alternative to a system which has completely failed. So that's why I think the two things are not really separate. They're really the same thing.
Yeah, just very quickly. I agree with Carl and a lot of what's been said. It's a populist or a multi-class movement. I think that its significance is that really upper strata of the working class, what's generally called the middle class, are really being affected, right, by this economic crisis, but that the real core of who is really going to fight for the real fundamental changes, right, at the level of the state, are going to be those people most adversely affected. So it's going to be, homeless and permanently unemployed people and so forth around their basic needs and the need for some way to reorganize society so that food, shelter, education, and healthcare can be distributed, right, to humanity because it actually exists. So I think that it becomes a political struggle rather than a struggle of capital against labor. At the point of production, it's more labor against the state, right? Because so much of it is not in struggle against employer.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. I think
Somebody had my report. Yeah, I got it.